So what about the criticisms of these commitments? I mean, what are the good reasons for agreeing with NACE about these commitments? I've kind of been collecting the reasons that NACE himself gives as we've gone along, but what are the reasons for disagreeing with these? Well, the first one, we saw already that there's at least a long philosophical tradition of emphasizing external relations too. So I think that a reasonable question might be, to what extent can we understand these systems if we think of them as always every element of the system is always extrinsically related, or excuse me, intrinsically related to every other entity in the system. It kind of becomes hard to define any of the individual entities and understand it individually. And if we think that at least some of physics has made the progress that it has by kind of isolating an individual system or part of a system and then articulating what are the laws that govern things of that type, that process, that particular procedure is a very extrinsic relations type way of thinking about the systems that are described. You think about a car, for instance. I mean, yes, the parts function together, but each individual part of the car has a certain shape and it's made of certain materials, and its interaction with the other parts of the car doesn't change what it is fundamentally, right? When you go to buy a new battery, you know it needs to be compatible with the rest of the car, but the battery itself isn't what it is because of the car that you put it in. The battery is just is what it is. You put it in the car, and then it's extrinsically related to other parts of the car, and that's what makes the machine run. So I think it's questionable, at least for philosophical reasons, how much nature really needs to be understood as a field of intrinsic relations in this way. Perhaps a broader way to put it is, are we really sure that this is the most effective way to think about ecology? Maybe there are some ways of thinking about ecology that are less total field relational, but are more effective in terms of bringing about specific results. If we think of ecosystems more like a machine with different parts that serve the, different parts that are related in the ways that they are more mechanically, maybe that would actually, at least in some cases, be a more effective way to think about ecosystems and better enable us to interact with them and, when necessary, make changes or somehow, take actions that we can predictably say will affect them in one way or another in line with what our aims are, whether it's repopulating a forest or whatever. With the biospherical egalitarianism principle, I think we can ask how far this qualification really goes. I mean, NACE is admitting that we can't actually practice this fully, but if we can't practice it fully, then that of course raises the question of, to what extent should we try to practice it at all? And when tough questions come up about, a conflict between, say, what we perceive as our interests and the interests of other living things, then how should we resolve it? This principle alone seems to sort of speak out of both sides of the mouth. On the one hand, it says, treat everything as having equal value. On the other hand, it says, we realize we can't do that. We can't actually do that. So what are we supposed to say about it? I mean, we can think about, again, Elliot Sober's criticism about what he called the demarcation problem. There's a really big demarcation problem here for deep ecology, at least in these principles as articulated by Ness. These principles don't tell us where to draw the line or how to make decisions about trade-offs. The next one, we might wonder exactly how tight the connection is between symbiosis producing diversity and how tight the connection is between symbiosis and diversity. Does symbiosis always produce diversity? Maybe sometimes it produces homogeneity. Does diversity always facilitate survival, or does it sometimes get in the way of survival? And also, why we should prefer diversity, why we should prefer symbiosis. I guess there's really a question about both. Why should we prefer either of these? So I think those are some questions, critical questions that can come up that maybe NACE hasn't made a sufficient case for the intrinsic value of either diversity or symbiosis. And then with the anti-class posture, we might wonder how much it really is the same commitments that motivate the other principles, the other commitments here, and that motivate the anti-class posture. In other words, is the anti-class posture something that is just a kind of addendum? Is it that Nace himself has a certain political orientation, that he's opposed to wealth disparities between groups of people? He thinks that those ought to be, reconciled somehow, and that he's just added this in, even though it doesn't really follow from the more environmental commitments that he's made? Or is it really something that naturally comes out of the other environmental commitments, or is kind of walks toe-to-toe with the other environmental commitments, so that it's very hard to be committed to these other principles if you don't also take an anti-class posture, that somehow the things are tightly theoretically linked? Now, that's a question that will come up repeatedly in the rest of the readings for this unit. We'll be asking about what are the implications of certain kinds of ways of thinking about and promoting relations between humans, and certain ways of thinking about and promoting relations between humans and non-human entities in nature. And that question of what's the relation between the social and the environmental is really at the core of a lot of what we're reading now. So this is an interesting thing to pay attention to from Nace in that context. I won't say any more here about what could be said in criticism of it. Number 5 is shared with the shallow ecology movement, and it's a pretty non-controversial premise, so I'll just leave that one alone too. With complexity and complication, we can ask about whether even the distinction really is a meaningful one, or how precisely to define it. Is it possible to measure the extent to which a system is complex versus complicated? And if not, there's a worry that we just are using the word complex to describe systems or results that we like, but we haven't really clarified why we like them. We may not even really ourselves understand why we prefer, why we prefer one thing or the other. Why is it necessarily better, relatedly, why is it necessarily better for humans to build furniture themselves versus work in a factory? Maybe working in a factory, a more fragmented line of work, is actually preferable for some people because they don't have to think about the details of making the furniture. They can just go to work, clock out at the end of the day, and maybe that's better. And certainly if you also couple that with better for those people if they prefer it. And certainly if you couple that with maybe some added productivity in the factory outfit as a whole, maybe arguably that is better overall. So what I'm trying to point out is just that so far the distinction between complexity and complication hasn't been articulated in a very precise way. And for that reason, where I think it's reasonable to worry that when Nace or anybody else says that a system is complex but not complicated, or that it's complicated but not complex, that they're really just saying, I like that system, I want to promote it, or I don't like that system. But they haven't clarified why they like it, either to themselves or to others, by using this complex, complicated distinction. And the last one, again, there are pros and cons of decentralization and of more locally centered divisions of power in government. There are benefits and weaknesses of that. So pointing to the potential weaknesses, they can include things like, how do you maintain consistency from one community to the next? If every town made its own laws, it might be fairly hard to travel because people wouldn't know what laws they would find in the next county over. And so having there be some degree of centralization helps to arguably makes people's lives better and richer, because there's more regularity to their interactions and to what's expected of them than would be the case if things were more decentralized. So again, I don't mean to answer any of these questions about whether you should agree with these commitments or not. I just mean to give some examples of ways that someone might challenge them even just as expressed in the 1973 paper. And of course, we've now read Murray Bookchin, and or very soon will, and Ramachandra Guha, and those authors are very critical of deep ecology, including these commitments, though they may have the 1985 iteration of deep ecology from Duvall and Sessions more in mind than this 1973 formulation.